Chapter 14. Let's talk a little bit about plain chant. Plain chant is the music of the church. This is one of the first types of music that we have history of. There was a pope, very famous pope, named Pope Gregory the Great from around 1590 to 604. And he codified or categorized church music. You're going to see the word liturgy. Liturgy is a set order of church services. So if churches are more contemporary nowadays, they're not going to have a liturgy. If you go to a traditional, like Catholic, sometimes Methodist, Lutheran churches will do this, they're going to have a set type of songs, psalms, readings that they do based on the calendar year, etc. And that's really what they mean by liturgy. So early on, all of these prayers that were in the liturgy and a lot of the different readings were set to music because it was said that it would give music would give it more of an emphasis. It would bring the listener to a more spiritual place. And so Pope Gregory began the process of not only writing some, but also arranging, collecting, and writing down, notating more than 3,000 melodies. Those were called plain chants. And then now we call them Gregorian chants after Pope Gregory. So there was a belief that these compositions were divine. You're going to hear some Greek, Hebrew, and Syrian influences in this. It's a very simple chant-like music, and that's where music started in the church. You can see a little example of some of the chant here of Pope Gregory. Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison. We'll talk about those words another time, but that's from a mass, and that is Latin words. You can see this notation, very different from traditional, where we know of as today, traditional music notation. But it gave the indication of where the pitches were, where they lined up to the text, etc. So here are some facts that I want you to know about plain chant or Gregorian chant. You can use those names interchangeably. But what I want you to know is that it was a single line melody, okay, one melody, no accompaniment, didn't have piano with it, wasn't a chorus of like soprano, alto, tenor, bass. It was literally just one single melody. Now that doesn't mean only one person could sing. You could have several people singing that one melody, just like you would sing, for instance, Happy Birthday, everyone singing Happy Birthday together. That's still one single line melody. That texture is called a monophonic texture, if you remember that. Monophonic means one line, okay? Not polyphonic, not homophonic, not heterophonic, all of this. Just monophonic. It's going to follow the natural rhythm of Latin text, okay? It's going to be non-metrical. So, for instance, when we think about music today, it's got certain rhythms, certain notes are longer than others, are very specific. This Gregorian chant or plain chant would just kind of follow freely as the text flowed. So it's going to feel like you're not going to be able to tap your foot to it. It's going to feel much different than music that you know of today. It didn't have wide leaps. It moved very small. So small steps up, small steps down gently. And there's some different text settings that you want to become familiar with: syllabic, pneumatic, and melismatic. Okay, syllabic, it's one note per syllable. All right. The opposite of that, melismatic, would be many notes per one syllable. So if you were singing Alleluia, that would be melismatic. Lots of notes to one syllable. And then there's pneumatic. All of these chants were passed down orally. Not a lot of it was written down until Gregory started collecting them. Those notes that I showed you in this previous one here, those are called neumes. Okay, they're not like traditional notes that we know of musical notation. but they suggested the musical contour. And the music was presented in something called modes. Modes, we've referred in the first unit to major and minor scales of major and minor scale. So before major and minor existed, modes existed. All right, and it had a lot to do with the starting note, but again, the music was not based on a regular octave like we know it today. So I want you to keep that in mind as you listen to this. It'll really change the way music sounds because of those modes. All right, let's talk briefly about the Mass. The Mass is a church worship service that is considered the reenactment of Christ's Last Supper. It is a very solemn ritual within the Catholic Church, and it has a liturgy. Remember, it's set prayers set to the calendar year. There are two different liturgies for the Mass. One is called the proper, and one is called the ordinary. The proper can change. It's got varied different portions. The ordinary is the same every time. Okay, so the ordinary of the Mass would be the same fixed portions that are the same every time. So when you went to Mass, these Gregorian melodies were central to the Mass. So Kyrie eleison was one example of a portion of the ordinary of the Mass. You would hear a Kyrie eleison every time you went to Mass. So I want you to take a listen to, with your listening guide, the Kyrie. You're going to hear an example of this Gregorian chant from the 10th century. It's going to be a cappella, which means no accompaniment. It's going to be sang antiphonally, meaning there's going to be some echoing type effects, choir to choir kind of singing to each other. There are three phrases. Each of them is going to be sung 3 times, and you're going to hear the melody is very conjunct and wave-like. There's some early pneumatic movement, and then you'll hear melismatic movement. But this is part of the Mass called Kyrie. Again, the text is very simple. Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison. All right, so monasteries were places where monks would go into seclusion to be able to study, to be able to be in prayer, to serve the Lord. Monks and nuns, okay, so it was a type of religious seclusion. And they were very, very dedicated. So in these monasteries, they had music every day as they did their daily offices. They sang psalms, they did prayers, and so a lot of the music we see coming out of medieval times comes from these monasteries because that's basically what they did the whole time. They did a lot of worshiping and a lot of praying. And so that helped give us a wealth of preservation of some music from the medieval time period. One of the most well-known composers from this time period, end of the 11th century into the 12th century, was a lady named Hildegard von Bingen, which is interesting because it's a lady. She was the daughter of a noble German couple, and she was well known as a poet, also as a prophet, and she was in a German monastery, very famous throughout Europe. In fact, people would come to her for advice because they thought she was somewhat of a prophet. She was actually made a saint in 2012, side note. Her musical style is very unique, so I want you to take a listen to that. You're going to hear some definite similarities to Gregorian chant, but this is going to be a lot more advanced. You're going to hear a lot more melismas, and those melismas paint a picture of what the word means as you hear it. And she uses a lot of different, more words that evoke pictures in her poetry, more creative language. So when you listen to her music, I want you to listen to those aspects and see how it differs from early Gregorian chant. The Alleluia o Virga Mediatrix is a prayer to the Virgin Mary. And so this is a text that was written by Hildegard. It's not considered a Gregorian chant. It's responsorial, which means you're going to hear the leader sing something, and then you're going to hear the group repeat it back or echo it back. And that has some roots back in the ancient Jewish tradition. But take a look at that song and listen to it and see what you think of it. We're going to skip that part. And one of the things to note about the Hildegard of Bingen the Alleluia is that it's going to be an a cappella choir, no instruments. It's going to have the soloist. Remember, we're going to have the soloist echoing back and forth. So the verse will be sung by the solo. You're going to hear some expressiveness, melismas with death, and also chastity. You'll be able to follow along with the translations in the listening guide. So the listening guide is also in the book. It's also in the PowerPoint if you want to refer to that. But you will see the text for the music in the examples that you'll be listening to in this listening guide. So you'll see the text, you'll see the form over here, and it'll give you kind of the goal of what to listen for, a little history of the piece. So that is what you're going to be looking at on these listening guides. Okay, so here's the Kyrie eleison one and the Hildegard of Bingen's Alleluia. There is some more of the text, so you can either refer to it here if you want to print this out or pause it or screenshot it, or you can look at it in your textbook. Thank you.